Okay, so this is going to be the lecture on the reproductive systems, chapter 28. On this first page, we have kind of an image of spermatozoa to the left, representing male reproductive system. And we have an image that we'll look at later on of the ovary to the right, showing different stages of follicular development of the follicles in the ovary to represent female reproductive system. That we'll get to, the chapter goes through male reproductive system first and female reproductive system second. So we always start with male reproductive, or we always start with functions. And since the chapter starts with male reproductive system, we have functions of male reproductive system. And we've got 4 basic functions that we're going to go through. Testes produce sperm and also secrete the hormone testosterone that helps with maturation of sperm. And then there's a ductal system that we're going to talk about that helps in producing sperm, transporting, and storing sperm. There's some accessory sex glands that create the liquid portion of semen, the part that is everything other than sperm. And then the penis contains the urethra. It is the passageway of semen and urine, and it's the male copulatory organ. It's what delivers the sperm into the female reproductive tract. And so we're going to go through these kind of 4 segments of the male reproductive system. First, we're going to look at the testes. Sex organs in male and female are usually just referred to generally as gonads. And when we did endocrine system and we talked about hormones acting on that segment of the reproductive system that makes the gametes or the sex cells, we just used the term gonads. Gonads is very general. It is not gender specific. And gametes, meaning sex cells, is very general and not gender specific. In the male, the gonads are the testes, and they produce the male sex cell, which is sperm. Then we have a system of ducts that are going to help sperm develop, transport them, and convey them to the exterior and store them until that time happens. Oops. I'm doing this with a mouse, and this is not the easiest thing to do with a mouse. So these 4 segments of the ductal system show in order the ducts that sperm go through after they develop into actually sperm or spermatozoa. They do that developing in the seminal vesicle in the testes, and then they go into the epididymis, and then the ductus deferens, or the vas deferens, into the ejaculatory duct, and then through the urethra. And so make sure that you know those 4 in order so that you could answer a multiple choice question on the final exam, like what are the order of these. And this also might help what you've been studying for lab, too, to try to clarify some of the ducts that we looked at on the male pelvic model. And then sperm doesn't actually pass through the accessory sex glands, but they help to compose the components of semen, and that's the seminal vesicles, the prostate, and the bulbourethral glands. And then at the end of the section on male reproductive system, we'll talk about the scrotum and the penis. So this is a figure from your book. On the bottom right, it's showing a cadaver photo or a cadaver view, but we're going to look kind of at the figure at the top left. This is a sagittal section. Anterior is to the right, posterior is to the left. And so it's showing all of these ducts in kind of this pathway of the ductal system that's through which sperm travel to get to the outside. Okay, so we start with, testes. That is where the sperm are going to be formed, and we're going to talk about that process in just a second. And then sperm start going through the ductal system. The epididymis is kind of the structure along the back side of the testis. And then from that we have the ductus deferens, and it goes up and over the urinary bladder and comes back down. Then we're going to have the ejaculatory duct, and then finally the urethra. And so that's kind of the pathway of the ducts that we're going to look at. And there's another view that we're going to look at that's going to be an anterior view that's going to show the ductus deferens as it goes up over the urinary bladder. So the testes are located in a structure called the scrotum. The scrotum is a supportive structure for the testes. And so the scrotum holds the testes outside of the body. Now the testes produce sperm, and normal sperm production occurs at a temperature just slightly below core body temperature, about 2 to 3 degrees below core body temperature. And so the scrotum holds the testes outside of the body so that we can the cremaster and the dartos muscles contract and relax to bring the scrotum closer to or farther away from the body to try to control that body temperature. And we talked about that a little bit in lab when we were talking about some of the functions of some of the structures we were looking at in the male pelvic model. And so here's an anterior view. Has cut away the penis so that we can see kind of cross-section of the penile structures inside. And so what I want to kind of show you is this structure here that they circle and they call the spermatic cord. And this contains a number of blood vessels, arteries, and veins that feed the testes, and it's surrounded by the cremaster muscle. And so on the model, the male pelvic model, it shows kind of a cross-sectional view of that spermatic cord. It shows that structure kind of with the blood vessels inside surrounded by that cremaster muscle. It shows that cremaster muscle as a red and white striped muscle. It's number 19 on the model. And so that's what they're trying to show you here, is that this spermatic cord contains these blood vessels. It's surrounded by that cremaster muscle, and the ductus deferens goes up through here also. And then the dartos muscle is just deep to the skin of the scrotum, and so they show the dartos muscle cut away here at the bottom. But those are the two muscles that surround the scrotum and determine the distance the scrotum is away from the body to help control the temperature for sperm production. So this is a figure. We're going to, from your book, we're going to focus on this top figure, which is showing a sagittal plane through the testis. And so one of the main structures inside the testis involved in sperm production is the seminiferous tubule. And so these are kind of convoluted tubules that are in these segments, in these kind of lobule-like segments of the testes. And that's where sperm is actually produced. And then sperm will go through a structure called the reedy testis or reedy testes, which is kind of here toward the center. And that leads into the efferent duct going into the epididymis. And so then the epididymis goes along this back side of the testis, from the head of the epididymis to the tail of the epididymis. From there, once it gets kind of down here, then it's going to go into the ductus deferens or the vas deferens, which is going to go through that spermatic cord. So when we talk about the testes and we talk about cells of the testes, we have cells called spermatogenic cells that help form sperm. And so we have these stem cells, spermatogonia is what they're called, and they develop during fetal development. And they go through these series of steps. This is a differentiation pathway, similar to other differentiation pathways we've talked about this semester, blood cell development, those kinds of things. So it becomes a primary spermatocyte, then a secondary spermatocyte, then something called a spermatid, and then it becomes a sperm cell. And it does that as it's moving from kind of the basement membrane of the duct toward the lumen of the duct. And I'm going to show you that in a figure in just a second. And then two other types of cells are Sertoli cells. These are kind of support cells. They nourish the spermatocytes. They produce fluid for sperm transport. They secrete a hormone called inhibin that we're going to talk about. And then the third cell type are these Leydig cells. They're found in the spaces in between the seminiferous tubules, and they are the cells that secrete testosterone. Now, again, we're trying to get away from naming things after people. So another name for Sertoli cells is now sustentacular cells, and another name for Leydig cells is interstitial cells. You can use either of those cell types, and if I give you a multiple choice question on the final, I'll use both names. So I'll use Sertoli with sustentacular in parentheses, Leydig with interstitial in parentheses, similar to the way that you see it here on this slide. And so these cells of the testes basically function to make and support sperm, to make a whole bunch of sperm and to try to keep them alive. Every day, about 300 million sperm complete spermatogenesis. So these are very small cells, as we'll see in a minute. There's not a lot to making a spermatocyte. So it's really easy for the male reproductive system to mature a large number of these cells. We're going to look at their structure. They have a head. That's where the nucleus is, and that's where a structure called the acrosome or acrosomal cap. And that's a vesicle that's filled with enzymes that help the sperm fertilize the egg. And then the tail piece contains the structures that form microtubules and a lot of mitochondria. The microtubules are what help that tail to beat. Spermatozoa are the only human cells that have a tail. Once ejaculated, most sperm do not survive more than 48 hours in the female reproductive tract. However, some active sperm can persist up to 7 to 10 days. And so this is one of the reasons that the rhythm method of contraception is not always accurate or effective, because if there are sperm in the female reproductive tract from a sexual encounter 10 days ago at the point of ovulation, then that egg could be fertilized. The window of opportunity for most sperm is within about 24 hours. You want sperm to unite with the egg within about 24 hours, but there are sperm that can be active and persist in the female reproductive tract past that time. So here's a figure from your book that shows spermatozoa or sperm. The left is a scanning electron micrograph, falsely colored. And then on the right, we can see some of these segments. We see the head that has this acrosomal cap that has enzymes in it. That's for penetrating a part of the ovum called the zona pellucida. And we're going to see that when we do the female reproductive tract. And then the tail has a lot of mitochondria in it. So basically, this cell makes a whole lot of ATP to move those mitochondria, to move that tail to swim. That's what they're highly, highly specialized to do. They do have a nucleus because they do have chromosomes, because that's the whole point, is to contribute half of the genetic material to an egg to fertilize the egg. And so this is a figure from your book that's showing how sperm develop. And so this is one of those tubules that's in the testes, one of the seminiferous tubules. And so this outer area is toward the basement membrane, and then the center is toward the lumen. And so the cells that are more toward the outside are the immature cells, like spermatogonium. And then they go through this maturation process to become a primary spermatocyte, and then they undergo meiosis and become a secondary spermatocyte, and eventually they become a spermatid and a mature sperm. And the figure down at the bottom shows this progression, this maturation process. And so when they get to be mature cells, they are at the lumen. And so the fluid can sweep them away and sweep them down the seminiferous tubule into the rest of that ductal system. And so the cells that are closest to this basement membrane are the most immature cells. And so as they move through the space in between these spermatogenic cells, they develop and they mature until they become these mature spermatocytes, these mature sperm cells with these wiggly tails, and then they can just get whisked away with the fluid into the rest of the tubular system. And so this process is controlled by hormones. Part of this we already know. We know about gonadotropin-releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, and it stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete LH and FSH. At the time, we just said it acts on gonads. In the testes, FSH stimulates Sertoli cells to help with that spermatogenesis process. LH stimulates Leydig cells to secrete testosterone. And then once we have a whole lot of sperm, the hormone inhibin can be released that inhibits FSH. So it kind of creates a bit of a negative feedback process. And so there's a figure that your book shows to show you this hormonal process. And so they show you hypothalamus, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, down the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary, FSH and LH. So that part we've already gotten. And so now we can fill in the details of FSH acts on spermatogenic cells to help those spermatocytes mature, and LH acts on Leydig cells to secrete testosterone. And testosterone is responsible for a lot of the male characteristics, development of the male in the uterus, enlargement of male sex organs during puberty, protein synthesis, muscle development, hair growth, some of those things testosterone is responsible for. So then once we develop those sperm in the testes, in the seminiferous tubules of the testes, the sperm will flow into the rest of the ductal system. And so pressure generated by the fluid that's secreted by Sertoli cells pushes the sperm along the lumen of the seminiferous tubules, and then they enter a series of tubes that get them from the testis, from the seminiferous tubules, into the epididymis. So some straight tubules, the reedy testes, and the efferent ducts to get into the epididymis. And so in the epididymis, we have stereocilia. These are cells that can reabsorb misformed or misshapen or degenerated sperm. This is where sperm acquire motility, and at this point they're able to fertilize. And the epididymis is this main site of storage of sperm. The epididymis can store sperm for several months. And then the epididymis continues as the ductus deferens or the vas deferens. On your lab sheet, I gave you several different iterations of the term for this duct. Vas deferens or ductus deferens are the most common terms for this duct. And so the vas deferens conveys the sperm forward, especially during sexual arousal, through peristaltic contractions of smooth muscle cells that surround the duct. But sperm can be stored in the vas deferens or the ductus deferens, again, for several months at a time. That spermatic cord that we looked at ascends out of the scrotum, consists of that ductus deferens, blood vessels, some nerves and lymphatic vessels, and the cremaster muscle. And so then that vas deferens is going to go kind of over the bladder and around the back. And it's going to unite with the seminal vesicle to form the ejaculatory duct. And then that leads into the urethra. And again, the urethra is a shared structure between the reproductive and the urinary systems. We can subdivide it into the prostatic urethra, which is the part of the urethra that goes through the prostate, the membranous urethra, which is the part that goes through some of the ejaculatory ducts, and then the spongy or the penile urethra, which is the part that actually goes through the penis. And the urethra ends at the external urethral orifice. And so we can look at this figure, which is showing, this is a posterior view. So this ductus deferens is going, coming from the testes and going up, circling around behind the bladder, going down through the prostate, and then into the penis. And we're going to continue that in the next kind of set of images that we're going to look at. These seminal vesicles are shown here. So this is kind of a posterior view. It's kind of a little bit difficult to kind of put this in the perspective of the pelvic model that we looked at because that's more of a sagittal view. But that shows kind of this vas deferens or ductus deferens going up over the urinary bladder and then the seminal vesicle here uniting with it. So sperm don't actually travel through any of the accessory glands of the male reproductive system. These are actually more kind of responsible for making the composition of the liquid portion of the semen. The seminal vesicles contribute about 60% of the semen. They secrete a very alkaline, viscous fluid. Contains fructose, a sugar to kind of help nourish the sperm, prostaglandins, which can act on the female reproductive system, and some clotting proteins, different from blood. So this isn't like fibrinogen or anything like that. The prostate contributes about 25% of the semen volume. It secretes a slightly acidic fluid, has citric acid or vitamin C, has some proteolytic enzymes, has an antibiotic. So this is really responsible for more protecting the sperm from bacteria and those kinds of things. And the bulbourethral glands are mostly responsible for secreting mucus that lubricates the end of the penis and the lining of the urethra. But this gland, I always thought that this was really interesting. It secretes a little bit of an alkaline fluid, and that actually kind of cleans out the urethra before ejaculation. So any urine that is still in the urethra, which is pretty acidic, is going to be neutralized by this secretion of the bulbourethral gland. And so they protect the sperm by neutralizing acids from the urine that might still be in the urethra. So semen is the liquid portion. It's everything other than the sperm. The liquid portion is made by the seminal vesicles, the prostate, and the bulbourethral glands, as we looked at on the previous slide. And then the sperm contribution comes from the testes. Typical volume is about 2.5 to 5 ml, about 50 to 150 million sperm per milliliter. So we got a lot of sperm coming out here. And semen has a slightly alkaline pH due to those seminal vesicle secretions. We're going to see as we talk about female reproductive system that vaginal secretions can be slightly acidic to try to help protect the female reproductive tract from bacterial and other infections. And so this slightly alkaline pH of semen can neutralize the acidic pH of the female reproductive tract. And those proteins help semen coagulate after ejaculation. So once the semen gets into the female reproductive tract or after ejaculation, that semen can thicken slightly, hopefully retaining it in the female reproductive tract longer. All of this is, evolutionary processes designed to try to get the sperm to up in that female reproductive tract to the egg as much as possible. The penis is the male copulatory organ. It's the passageway to eject semen and excrete urine from the body. We're going to see in a figure that we look at that there's some kind of spongy areas. There's the corpus cavernosum and the corpus spongiosum. And these contain erectile tissue, which has a lot of blood sinuses. And so flow of blood into this area can cause engorgement that we associate with erection. And we're going to look at that in the next figure. And then the glans penis covers that external urethra orifice as a foreskin in uncircumcised men. So this foreskin helps to protect the end, and that foreskin is what's removed during circumcision. So here's a figure that is showing a frontal plane that's kind of showing these areas of spongiosum and cavernosum that lie along the urethra. And then to look in cross-section, then we can see these areas that have a lot of arteries, the deep arteries. So there's going to be a lot of blood that flows into this area, and that's what's going to cause engorgement. So we've gone through these four. I've gone back to slide number 2. So the testes produce the sperm and also produce testosterone. There's a series of ducts. We went through 4 ducts in order. From the seminiferous tubules, we went to the epididymis, the ductus deferens, the ejaculatory ducts, and the urethra. We talked about the accessory sex glands that comprise the liquid portion of semen. The seminal vesicles make up about 60% of that. And then we talked a little bit about the structure of the penis. And one of the things that I think I put in your study guide was to look at the hormonal regulation of some of the events of the male and female reproductive system. And so if we're looking at hormonal events that regulate events in the male reproductive system, this figure 28.7 is going to be a figure to look at. FSH acts on spermatogenic cells to help sperm maturation. LH acts on Leydig cells to cause testosterone secretion. So female reproductive system. Female reproductive system becomes slightly more complicated because female reproductive system is not only responsible for making ova or eggs, but female reproductive system is going to have to support pregnancy should the egg become fertilized. And actually, all of the functions of the female reproductive system are working to support a fertilized egg. It's only if that fertilized egg does not occur that we have menstruation and we start the whole thing over again. So as you're learning about female reproductive system, if you keep in mind the female reproductive system is trying to support pregnancy if at all possible, then you can understand some of the functions that we're going through. So the gonads in the female are the ovaries. They produce gametes called oocytes and hormones. They produce a lot of hormones, progesterones and estrogens, as well as inhibin and something called relaxin. The uterine tubes or fallopian tubes transport the oocyte to the uterus, and the uterine tubes are typically the site of fertilization. Because the sperm can swim so fast with their little tail that they get way up there into those uterine tubes or fallopian tubes, and they meet the egg. And then the uterus is usually the site of implantation of the fertilized egg, the development of the fetus. Uterus contracts during labor to expel the fetus for birth. The vagina receives the penis during intercourse, is a passageway for childbirth. So sperm go in, baby comes out of the vagina. And then also in the female reproductive system, we talk about mammary glands. Because if we do support pregnancy, the mammary glands begin to synthesize, secrete, and eject milk for newborn nourishment. And so that becomes one of the functions of the female reproductive system. So as we go through the structures that we're going to talk about, we're going to start talking about ovaries. The uterine tubes or fallopian tubes, also sometimes called oviducts. That's kind of an archaic term. It's not a term that we use so much anymore, but you may hear that. We'll talk about the uterus and the vagina. We can talk about the external genitalia, and we can talk about structure of mammary glands. So this is a figure from your book, cross-section, very similar to the kind of sagittal section of the female pelvis model that we've been using in lab to study. And so it kind of gives relative position for several of the organs that are in the female reproductive tract. And so we can look at the uterus. Uterus lies slightly superior and a little bit posterior to the urinary bladder. And so the position of the uterus is usually anti-flected or antiverted, meaning it kind of flops over toward the front in most people. There are women where the uterus is slightly retroflected or retroverted. That usually doesn't have any bearing on pregnancy or any of those kinds of things. It's just kind of the position of the uterus in the lower abdomen. Slightly antiverted position is normal for most women. They also, as they did in the male, also show you kind of rectum to be able to put it in perspective of the digestive system also. So they're also showing you here bone. They're showing you the pubic symphysis. This is where the two pelvic bones come together in the front. So we're going to start off by talking about the ovaries. This is the way we started off in male reproductive system, talking about the testes. Ovaries are two paired gonads homologous to the testes. They produce gametes. These are secondary sex cells, secondary oocytes. They actually are kind of in a suspended animation state, and once fertilization occurs, the nucleus kind of finishes a maturation process to fuse the nucleus of the ova with the nucleus of the sperm. Now, there's a series of ligaments that we can find here in the female reproductive tract, and so I've tried to kind of summarize them here. The broad ligament is part of the parietal peritoneum. So it's a very broad, like a sheet type of a tendon or ligament, and that helps to hold the ovaries in place as well as hold the uterus in place. The ovarian ligament attaches the ovary to the uterus, and the suspensory ligament attaches the ovaries to the pelvic wall. And so this is a photograph from the classic anatomical text Gray's Anatomy. It was an anatomy book before it was a popular television show. And so they're showing, this is actually a posterior view. So we're looking from the back. Shows uterus, and it shows this broad ligament, shows this very large sheet. The ligament of ovary is what we call the ovarian ligament, which is this ligament that anchors the ovary to the uterus. And then this is the uterine tube. And then the round ligament actually kind of comes out where these ovarian vessels are and attaches to the wall, to the pelvic wall. And then another view, this is a superior view of this transverse plane, posterior is toward the back, anterior is toward the front. So we see the uterus. It's kind of flopped over the top of the urinary bladder. And so the ovaries are on either side. And we have this ovarian ligament that's holding the ovary to the uterus. And then we have the uterine tube, which is going from the uterus around to the ovary. And again, they give you structures from the digestive system to try to kind of put this in perspective. So then we can look at the histology of the ovary. This is going to be the microscopic anatomy of the ovary, and this is what happens to the egg leading up to and after, or what happens in the ovary leading up to and after ovulation. I have something called terminal epithelium. And this does not actually give rise to the egg cells. The cells that come from here are going to help form the yolk sac, which is going to kind of develop into the placenta in a fertilized egg. There's a whitish capsule of dense connective tissue called the tunica albuginea. Albuginea means white, so a white layer. The ovarian cortex, again, cortex is the outside of any type of an organ. The medulla is the inside, and in the medulla, you have the ovarian follicles. Sorry, in the cortex, you have the ovarian follicles, and that's where the oocytes are. In those ovarian follicles, you have oocytes that are in various stages of development. Once that oocyte matures, that becomes a mature follicle called a Graafian follicle. That one's ready to ovulate. And then after ovulation, it turns into kind of a yellowy, fatty area of the ovary called the corpus luteum. Luteum means yellow. This produces the progesterone. That progesterone is what's going to support pregnancy if the egg is fertilized. So this is a figure that's showing kind of these three different, or these four different kind of phases of the follicle development. So the follicles are in the cortex of the ovary. We're going to see that in just a second in the next figure. And the follicles contain an oocyte. This late primary follicle has what are called granulosa cells. And so when that becomes a secondary follicle, when it goes through meiosis and it becomes a haploid cell, those granulosa cells form something called the corona radiata, which is a ring of these granulosa cells around the egg. And even in this mature Graafian follicle, we still have the corona radiata. That's what the sperm has to get through in order to get to the egg to fertilize it. And so that's why the sperm needs that acrosomal cap that secretes enzymes to eat through this layer of granulosa cells to actually get to the ovum. And so in this top figure, we can look at this maturation. Now, there's all these follicles all over the ovary. They show you this as a progression, step to step to step to step. But these are all over the ovary, and they're in various stages. So they show you the primary follicle, and that develops into the secondary follicle. You can see kind of the space, that antrum, and you can see the ovum surrounded by the corona radiata, the granulosa cells. Then we have a mature or Graafian follicle that has even more of that follicular fluid, and that is ready for ovulation. And so when we get hormonal stimulation that we're going to talk about in just a second, we get release of that secondary oocyte with that corona radiata around it. And then that follicle starts producing hormones, and it degenerates into the corpus luteum, which secretes progesterone to sustain pregnancy. And then eventually it degrades into something called the corpus albicans, which is kind of basically scar tissue, to tell you the truth. So oogenesis begins before females are born. You've probably heard that. You've probably heard when you're born you have the whole number of egg cells that you're ever going to have. And to some extent that's true because oogenesis begins during development. And those germ cells differentiate into something called oogonia or oogonia, similar to spermatogonia, which are diploid cells. Now, a lot of these are going to degenerate. That's called atresia. Some develop into primary oocytes, and they go into the first stage of meiosis. These are covered by a single layer of follicular cells, and so this is called a primordial follicle. You have about 200,000 at birth. Women have about 200,000 at birth. About 4,000 remain at puberty, and around 400 will mature into ovulated ova during a lifetime. Those follicular cells in the primordial follicle divide and become the granulosa cells that form that corona radiata. So this is controlled by hormones. Each month from puberty to menopause, FSH and LH, which are secreted because of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, stimulate the development of several primordial follicles. But just in case something kind of goes wrong with one, several are stimulated, but usually only one goes through all of the steps of meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, becoming the secondary and then the mature follicle. The primordial follicles develop into primary develop into secondary. Secondary are going to mature into the Graafian follicles for ovulation. And so here I've put the granulosa cells to make that follicular fluid in that space called the antrum. And then those granulosa cells attach to the zona pellucida, and which is a specialized membrane around the egg, and form what's called the corona radiata. And so at ovulation, that oocyte is expelled with that corona radiata, those granulosa cells. If fertilization does not occur, all these cells degenerate. And the remainder of the cell membranes and all that is just lost with menstrual fluid. If the sperm penetrates the secondary oocyte, then meiosis II resumes, and then the two nuclei of the cells fuse. There's something called the second polar body that's formed, and it kind of contains some extra genetic material that gets extruded, and then the nuclei fuse to form a diploid zygote. So there's a lot of details about that fertilization step. We can talk a lot about all of the meiosis steps, the chromosome separation and those kinds of things. We haven't really done genetics, so some of that is not going to make a lot of sense. I'd be happy to talk to you guys about some of those events if you're curious, but those specific types of things are not going to be on your final exam, so I'm not kind of going into those kind of details. So once ovulation occurs, the oocyte with the corona radiata is released into the uterine tube or fallopian tube or oviduct, and that's going to provide a route to get it to the uterus and for the sperm to get up to that egg. There's an area of that uterine tube called the infundibulum, which is the part that kind of wraps around the ovary. And the fimbriae are the finger-like projections, and they help produce currents that sweep the egg into the uterine tube. The ovary is not actually connected to the uterine tube, and those kind of finger-like projections surround the ovary so that when the egg is released, it can kind of be swept into the uterine tube. The inner layer is called a mucosa. It has a huge amount of cilia that beat to try to convey the cells down toward the uterus. Underneath that is the muscularis layer, huge amount of smooth muscle to try to do some peristaltic contractions. So again, we're trying to get these cells conveyed down to the uterus. This is the figure that you studied for your lab quiz that I forgot to give you guys. And so this shows the infundibulum area that ends in these finger-like projections, the fimbriae. So this infundibulum is what wraps around the ovary. That's where the suspensory ligament attaches. And that this whole thing is lined with cilia that are trying to get these cells down into the lumen of the uterus, the uterine cavity. This is a figure from your book showing all this cilia. On the left is a light micrograph that shows all of the cilia that are on these little finger-like projections. And then on the right, you have a scanning electron micrograph that's really showing the microvilli and the ciliated columnar epithelial cells. So we're really trying to convey these cells down into the uterus. So once we get into the uterus, we can talk about some of the anatomy of the uterus. We have different regions of the uterus. The normal position is anteflected or kind of flipped over anterior and superior over the bladder. The only part of the uterus that we really talked about name of as far as lab anatomy was we talked about the cervix. The cervix is the bottom part of the uterus that opens into the vagina. And so we talked a little bit when you were looking at that previous figure for your quiz about the endometrium. That's the inner layer. This is the lining that either supports pregnancy if fertilization has occurred, or the lining that sloughs off during menstruation. And there's a lot of smooth muscle that surrounds uterus. You have to have a lot of muscle that will contract to expel a fetus for labor and delivery in response to oxytocin, which we talked about for the posterior pituitary, which we talked about for the endocrine chapter. So continuing down the female reproductive tract, the cervix. The cervix produces cervical mucus. This is produced by secretory cells that are in the mucosa, the lining of the cervix. There's some enzymes. Most of the time during the menstrual cycle, cervical mucus is fairly acidic and fairly thick. It can even form a little bit of a plug because we're trying to keep bacteria and other types of things from getting up into the uterus and creating an infection. But near ovulation, under some of the hormonal circumstances that take place, it becomes a little bit thinner and a little bit more alkaline. So it's more hospitable to sperm near ovulation. So the cervix opens into the vagina. The vagina extends from the cervix, from the exterior of the body of the uterus, from the exterior of the body to the uterine cervix, to the cervix, to the opening of the uterus. It is the exit for menstrual flow. It is the entrance for sperm. It is the female copulatory organ, and it forms the birth canal. External female genitalia. I didn't really include the figure from your book, but there is a figure so that you can look at some of these. The mons pubis cushions the pubic symphysis. When we were in A&P 1, when I teach about pubic symphysis, I often talk about how it often hurts when you hit that piece of cartilage that is in the pubic symphysis in the front. So the mons pubis is designed to kind of cushion that. The labia majora and the labia minora help protect the opening to the urethra and the vagina. The clitoris is homologous to the glans penis or glans penis. Clitoris is homologous to the end of the penis, has lots and lots of nerve endings, has blood vessels. The clitoris can actually experience erection when engorged with blood. And similar to the glans penis, stimulation of the clitoris can lead to orgasm. And so the vestibule is the area inside the labia minora, has where the urethra comes out, has the openings of several glands there that create and secrete fluid, and has the vaginal opening. So that whole area where the urethra opening and the vaginal opening are is called the vestibule. So we went through and talked about ovaries. We talked about the follicles, and we talked about kind of the physical mechanism of ovulation. We're getting ready to talk about the hormonal regulation here in just a second. We talked about the fallopian tubes. We talked just kind of in general about the structure of the uterus. Really, the endometrium is the only part of the uterus that I'm talking about in any kind of detail. And then we talked about cervix, cervical mucus, vagina, external organs, and we're going to talk about mammary glands here before we finish, I think, maybe, if I have enough time. So when we talk about female reproductive cycle, there's actually two cycles that we're usually talking about. There's the uterine cycle, or what's happening with the uterus. That's kind of menstruation and some of those kinds of things that we talk about. And the ovarian cycle. And sometimes when we talk about female reproductive cycle, we're talking about the hormonal cycle that regulates this. So we're going to go through and kind of talk about how the hormones regulate this. There's about 6 slides that I want to talk about hormonal regulation of female reproductive cycle. The ovarian cycle is the events in the ovaries that occur during and after maturation of the oocyte. And the uterine cycle, or the menstrual cycle, is a concurrent series of changes in the uterine endometrium, preparing it for the fertilized ovum, and then we slough it off and start all over again if there is no fertilized ovum. And this hormonal regulation is a little bit more complicated. And I'm actually going to go through and look at a couple of the figures before I come back to this slide, because this slide is kind of in words what we're showing in the figures. So this is a figure that's kind of similar to the one we looked at in the male reproductive cycle. GnRH leads to FSH and LH. FSH stimulates the follicle to grow, stimulates the ovaries. LH can stimulate ovulation and stimulates the corpus luteum. This is really hard to do with a mouse. But this is the figure that I think best shows what these hormones are actually doing. This is showing the days of the menstrual cycle. For most women, the menstrual cycle is about 28 days in length. And so this is showing days 0 through 28. So usually about day 14 is about the time that you're getting ovulation. So again, they're showing GnRH causing LH and FSH. They've color-coded it. So FSH is in purple and LH is in yellow. And then in this segment of the figure, they're showing the ovarian cycle. These primordial follicles become primary, become secondary, become mature Grothian follicles. They undergo ovulation. You get this corpus luteum, and eventually it becomes a corpus albicans. This part of the figure shows what's happening with the menstrual lining. And so menstrual cycle day 1 is the beginning of actual menstruation. So the beginning of this is losing this lining of the uterus. Changed colors somehow. Losing this lining of the uterus. And then as these hormones continue to be secreted, we go through this proliferative phase where we build up more lining of the uterus, again, in preparation for a fertilized egg if it happens. If it doesn't happen, then we'll lose that lining again starting day 1 of the next cycle. And these are all controlled by hormones. And so LH tends to peak right around the time that you get ovulation because LH is leading to ovulation. And then a drop in this progesterone and estrogen is what initiates menstruation, because this corpus albicans is making all that progesterone, and then once we get implantation, then development of the placenta takes over that progesterone. So if you don't get implantation, then you don't start making that placenta, then you don't continue to have that progesterone, and that drop in progesterone triggers menstruation. So you guys know how much I love that Martini textbook. So this is the figure from Martini et al. Shows very similar things. Here's the follicular stages that they're showing of the ovary. Here's the lining of the uterus. They're showing the exact same things. They're showing estrogens and progesterone. Drop in both of those is what leads to menstruation. They separate LH and FH and the estrogens and progesterones. And I think that that's pretty helpful because that shows this peak in LH that leads to ovulation. And the other thing that they show that they don't show in your textbook is this basal body temperature. A lot of times when women are trying to predict ovulation, they measure their basal body temperature because there is a slight elevation in basal body temperature at the point of ovulation. It's reliable. If you measure your basal body temperature, you can start to figure out when you can predict within a few days of the next cycle when you might ovulate. But if you're measuring your basal body temperature every day, when you see the temperature spike, you know you just ovulated. And so that's something that's shown in this figure that's not shown in the figure in your textbook. So if you're looking to correlate the events of the female reproductive cycle, you can either use this figure 2824 or you can use the Martini and Al figure. But those are putting together the events of the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle, and the hormonal events. What? This is a figure that's just showing that this LH surge brings about ovulation, and we can see that this ovulated oocyte has this corona radiata around it. So this really emphasizes that LH surge initiates that ovulation piece. So this is the slide that I would study for 2020 from your text because it's going to help to kind of put together some of the hormonal events that are controlling some of the physical structures, ovulation that we talked about, and menstruation, losing the lining of the uterus if the fertilized egg does not occur. So I tried to put on your study guide what the short answer questions would be, and I'm hoping that that kind of helps with what those short answer questions are going to be. As far as multiple choice questions, they're going to stay pretty straightforward related to this chapter. I'll ask about the ductal system in the male, some things about sperm production, and then in the female, I'll ask kind of some structural things about ligaments, ovary, uterus, cervix kinds of things. I may ask some things about the granulosa cells that surround the egg and how that forms the corona radiata. And then I'll ask some things about what hormones actually lead to ovulation, what hormone drops lead to menstruation, estrogen and progesterone, and those kinds of things. So if you have specific questions, either related to lecture or just things that you're curious about, please feel free to send me an email. You can do that through the Blackboard course shell. And if you have other questions that I can answer, please let me know.